I do want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for Life After the Storm, Finding Your Way Forward After Loss, um, hosted by NAMI Dane County. So we have Olika Parker who will be leading our conversation this evening. She is our certified peer support specialist and our certified parent peer support specialist. So, of course, it's recorded. So I'll be sending out recordings to everyone who registered later next week. Everyone's camera and audio is turned off for the duration of the workshop, but please use the chat to make any comments or add any questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Alika.
Hi, welcome everybody. I'm really glad you're here today. I'm Olika Parker. I am a certified support and a certified parent peer support at NAMI Dane County. Um, I want to start by acknowledging that joining a space like this takes courage. Loss can be really heavy, it can be personal, and it can sometimes feel isolating. Whether your loss happened recently or many years ago, or whether it's something others recognize or something you carry quietly, you belong here. Just so everybody knows, this is a peer led, trauma informed space. It means we aren't here to fix each other, to rush healing, or to put timelines on our own grief or anybody else's grief. Um, so I just want to name what that we will be talking about death and loss and grief today. And if at any point it's too much, it's okay to pause and ground yourself and step away. If at any point um you can put a note in the chat and Quinn can chat with you privately if you're having a hard time. Um, I will be giving my phone number if anybody wants to talk after this. Sometimes these things can bring up really big feelings. There's no right way to be here. Um, do what you need for yourself. Um, just so everybody knows, this is a really safe space, and I hope you feel safe here. So everybody's grief story is honored and is valid, even when it looks different than what mine has or what anybody else's has. So, before we go any further, let's take a moment just to ground ourselves in the moment and arrive together in this space. If you're able, put your feet on the floor, put your hands on your heart or your stomach, and take 3 deep breaths. As you're ready, I invite you, if you want to type a word in the chat that describes how you're arriving here today. There's no right or wrong word. Just notice what's here and how you're arriving here. If you don't want to put it in, acknowledge it and notice where you're at. So, understanding the storm, um, and understanding the loss. So, when we talk about the storm of loss, we're not just talking about death itself. Loss takes much more from us than a person. It can take our sense of identity, our feelings of safety, ideas of our future plans, our daily routines, and the roles we thought we were meant to have. When someone dies, the world we knew can disappear with them. Grief isn't linear. I have a picture here of the stages of grief. Those stages don't go in any order whatsoever. And then we also need to remember that trauma and grief often overlap. And so it's important to remember that and think about grief sometimes in a trauma lens. Oops, sorry. So I want to share a little bit of my own story because lived experience is what grounds this workshop. Um, I had loss growing up. I did have a profound loss of a child cousin. Um, that was pretty profound to me at a younger age. But my first really hard loss personally, 20 years ago, I was pregnant with twins, boy girl twins. And at 31 weeks, they couldn't find my daughter's heartbeat. At 32 and a half weeks, I delivered my twins, Clayton and Clara. Clara was delivered stillborn. And that was probably one of the hardest grief experiences. There was a lot of layered grief because I had a child, but I lost a child. Just safety of my child that was born. There were so many layers of trauma and grief entwined into that um it was like grieving a child while still being a parent, while being responsible but being devastated at the same time, and loving deeply this new child, my first child, while being completely broken during that point in time. The layers of grief didn't cancel out itself, it just stacked on top of each other. um, 11 years later, my children's father was diagnosed with lung cancer. And we lost Miles the day before we were supposed to be legally married. Um, and there was very little time to prepare or even process like illness, let alone death. Um, we were planning for our future. And the next thing I knew, I was grieving the life that we had together, the life that my children would have with their father. Um, and it really brought on shock, a lot of an anticipatory grief, um, and then a total identity switch from having a co-parent, having a partner to everything changing overnight and becoming a single mother. Um, so, and with that grief, um, with both, it's, they never end. So, what grief has really taught me is that it doesn't ever end. Um, it changes, it softens sometimes in certain places. It shows up differently over time, but it doesn't disappear. Um, I won't ever move on from my grief. but I learned how to live with it and process through it. Um, my grief, like it says, it never changes, it never goes away. This year will be 10 years that my partner will be gone, that Miles will be gone. And it's starting to be that he'll have been gone longer than he was here with my child. So it's a whole different type of grief now, a different part of grief that I'm grieving 10 years later that's affecting how I feel. Um, so it's, you don't ever move on. Like I said, you learn to live with it. I want you guys to think about this. I invite you guys to like reflect yourself. Um, if you want to share it in the chat, you can, you don't have to. But I want you to think of, if you have a great loss in your life, what it's taken from you besides the person themselves, and how that changed how you see the world and yourself. And I think this is one of those things that, as we simply notice, like, what it feels like. There's no right, there's no wrong. And I think that's really important to talk about. It's it's individual to each person. So a lot of people during grief, we all hear it. Oh, they'll move on. Things will get better. Um, a lot of times when we're grieving, we feel pressure to move on or be strong or be graceful after loss. Um, for me, it was, well, look at how Jackie O was after her husband died. Like, what can I do to be graceful like that? Um, and a huge thing with loss is that makes sometimes that pressure sometimes can be either internally or it can be external, um, to be strong. We can do it to ourselves too. Um, so the pressures that we feel a lot of times come from discomfort others feel around us and around our grief and our vulnerability. Um, there's a lot of cultural messages that praise resilience, um, but avoid pain, or don't teach us how to relate to pain. Um, and if you've had a profound loss in your life, um, the well meaning comments like, you're so strong, or they won't want you to be sad, that can really pressure us to feel like we have to move on from our grief. Like I said, our grief never ends. There's really not moving on. Over time, um, these pressures of being strong and being the strong person can really lead people to hide their grief or to minimize their pain. They can feel shame for still struggling. I know I did a lot of crying on my way to work by myself. Um, Sharing my grief with others is not something that I do well. So I do it. I do understand the concept of this. Everybody telling me how strong I was made me feel like I needed to be strong, so I couldn't show the moments when I wasn't strong. Um, And disenfranchised grief like that is grief that isn't acknowledged, it isn't supported, and that can look like um it was really hard with my daughter because pregnancy and infant loss are looked at differently. Um, it's hard anytime somebody asks me how many kids I have. Um, Grief lasts way longer than people think it's going to last. Like I said, it never ends. And so because of that, um, that disenfranchisement of your grief because you're not being supported by from society. Society thinks we should go through the 7 phases of grief and then just move on. Um, and grief doesn't fit into cultural norms like those 7 stages of grief. Um, so grief can become invisible, even though it's present. And that's because of how society is uncomfortable with long term grief. People don't know how to talk about long term grief. When grief is invisible, people feel isolated, they feel misunderstood, and they question whether their pain is valid. Um, I feel like there's a myth about closure. Closure suggests that there's a clear ending to something. And in reality, for me, I didn't want closure. I wanted to learn how to integrate my grief into my life. Um, because I knew if I just stopped or tried to push it down, it wouldn't be resolved. Um, Grief doesn't resolve, like I said, by closing those doors. It shifts as life continues. And I think that's not something we learn. That's not in the 7 stages of grief. Um, Letting go of the idea of closure can really reduce the pressure and self judgment that a lot of times we have for feeling guilty, for still feeling a loss. Um, we also need to remember that um, grief affects our nervous system. And after a loss, the nervous system may already remain in a state of threat or shock. Um, that can look like hypervigilance, being exhausted, difficulty concentrating, strong emotional reactions, being activated by really small things. Um, those signs aren't a sign of weakness in the way that you're dealing with your grief. They are your body's attempt to protect you after trauma. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough. How our bodies tries to protect us like that. Um, Another thing that can happen is grief can exist in 2 different ways. It can exist as grief bursts, which are sudden, intense waves of emotion. They're usually triggered by a smell, a memory, a song, a moment, a place. And then another type of grief is grief background noise. It's quieter, it's ongoing. It's that presence that shapes everyday life, even when emotions aren't intense. So, um, for me, it just might little things in my everyday life that I miss my partner for, or um, that background grief for me with my daughter was watching her twin brother grow up and at certain milestones wondering and how it would be, for her at those milestones. So that kind of both are normal grief. The quieter grief doesn't mean that the loss was any less. It just means that my body has learned how to carry it better. Um, excuse me. So that kind of leads into why anniversaries and milestones really hurt and are hard. Um, I had a hard time writing and making this workshop at the beginning of 2026. I already knew in the back of my mind that this year would be 10 years that Miles has been gone, my partner. And at the beginning of the year, there was all of these things about 10 years ago in 2026, and TikTok was talking about it. And it really triggered that milestone of 10 years. Um, Anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, um, like I said, milestones, um, those things reactivate our grief because they remind our nervous system of what's missing. What, um, even years later, these moments can bring strong emotional or physical reactions. It's not regression of your grief, it's remembrance. Sometimes anticipating these dates and offering yourself extra care can really help soften their effect, giving yourself some grace. Okay. I also want to acknowledge um, and normalize that grief just isn't an emotion. Sorry, it's also physical. So it can be fatigue, it can be brain fog, anxiety, sudden waves of sadness. Those aren't signs that you aren't dealing with your grief well, or that you're a weak person, or that you have weaknesses. They're signs that your nervous system is responding to trauma and loss. Your body is doing the best it can to protect you. So, finding your way forward, support that matters. Um, so support looked different for both of my big losses. Support after Miles was um he was at a grace, and we were in hospice before he passed. And so they played a huge role in my grief support. We did children and family, or children and parent support groups where we all ate a meal together. And then the children would break off with a facilitator for their group, and the parents would break off who had lost a partner for a facilitator for their group. That group was wonderful for me, and my daughter got a lot out of it. It was not a good thing for my son, and I allowed him not to do it. I didn't require him to be there. Being in the building where his dad had died was a very hard thing for him. Um, Whereas for my daughter and I, we felt kind of comfort being in that same building. Um, they didn't try to fix my pain. We all sat with each other and listened to each other and held space. Um, Sometimes there were words, um, and other times, because the support of others with lived experience going through the same thing at the same time, that really helped with crazy thoughts I thought I was having, um, or thoughts I had of that I wasn't grieving right or I wasn't doing this right. The questions of parenting by myself, being with others that were peers and going through the same thing in a supportive group while my child was getting the support in a different group with children who had gone through this same thing really helped us right after we lost their dad. Support looked really different after I lost Clara. First off, it was our first children. So we had a child in the NICU and we had this profound loss. Um, After losing Clara, we really had family and church show up. Um, their presence in our life really made a difference during that really hard transition of losing a child and welcoming a new child who was still hospitalized for a few weeks. It didn't erase the pain, but it reminded me that I wasn't alone during that time, and we as a family weren't alone, and that was really important. So, community support can be wonderful and family support, but also support from peers going through the same thing as you can also be very important. There's no one right way to get support. Um, Support can be, like I said, peer support. It can be professional one on one support with a therapist. It can be spiritual support. It can be cultural community support. And it can be personal rituals. You are allowed to need help more than once and in different ways over time because grief never ends. So I invite you guys, if you have paper and pen by you and taking notes or anything like that, I invite you to reflect on these three things. This is a gentle support map for when we're grieving. Um, it's three things. So it makes it very simple. Um, a person or a place that feels safe, one thing that helps me even a little, and one boundary I might need to make right now. And when we're grieving, being able to reflect and go to one of these things is a safe way of finding support. So, I want to talk briefly about hope. I want to preface that hope doesn't mean we forget. Um, it doesn't mean we're being positive. And it doesn't mean we're going back to who we were before our loss that has changed us. Sometimes hope means just sometimes getting through the day. It's allowing joy and grief to exist at the same time. And I think it's sometimes hard for us to remember that and instead of or. Um, when we're grieving, we think we can only grieve or we can be happy, where we can grieve and be and have hope. And hope looks different for everybody. Um, but we need to remember that hope doesn't mean we're forgetting people and the ones we love. It um, doesn't mean that we aren't being positive, um, or that we are being positive. And it's that and that really defines hope. So, what does hope look for me now? For me now, hope looks like carrying the love I had for both of these people forward, um, honoring both of my children. Um, I've learned how to live a meaningful life alongside my grief, not in spite of my grief. My grief is part of my story, but it's not the end of it. When first grieving, I always felt that there had to be a right or wrong way to grieve. And it's taken a long time for me to understand that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. We need to allow ourselves to both have hope for our future and the changes in our lives and grieve at the same time. Are there any questions from anybody in the chat at all? No. Okay. Let's continue going on. So, so I'd like you guys, after all of that I've just talked about, it's a lot. It can bring up a lot of things for a lot of us. So before we close, before we get to talking about resources, I'd like everybody just to put your hand on your heart. If it feels okay, take a slow breath in and a longer breath out. Just one final breath together. I'm sorry, I need to plug my computer in. So some final words. We are not broken. We are responding to love. There's a saying that says grief is a way of showing love for a person that's gone. Um, remembering that we aren't broken and we can be hopeful for our futures while still being scared of what our futures look like because of our losses. Remembering that the loss isn't always just the person, and it's usually much more things. Um, I wanted to share some resources, some grief resources. Um, Dane County has our peer programs and peer support. A Grace Hospice has a grief support services. Heartlight Center is grief support. Um, that's through Crest Funeral Home, but also for the community. You don't have to be going through Crest. Um, Also, most faith-based and community, in some communities have local groups. I found great resources in grief support groups and being by others who were going through similar things for me. That helped me know at that point in time, whatever was going through my mind, I wasn't crazy, that the feelings I were having were justified, being with peers and working with peers in a support group like that. But I've also used therapy to deal with my grief and my individual parts of my grief, just with one on one therapy. So I think sometimes utilizing multiple resources when we're dealing with grief can be really helpful. I really want to thank everybody for being here and trusting this space and showing up exactly how you were. Um, the resources I've shared today, I hope they can help support you, because we don't have to walk in this alone. We're here. Um, if peer support or family peer support is something that you would be interested in, please give Dane County a call, and you'll be transferred to me or our other peer support, and we can help you walk through these grief journeys or help you find resources. This card here is our local crisis resource card. These have different crisis numbers for here in Dane County. And then again, I just want to thank everybody for being here. Listening and hearing and talking about grief can be really hard, but can also be really healing. And remembering the and, we can grieve and still be happy. Um, Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alika, for thank you for sharing your story with us, and giving some useful tools for kind of navigating loss and just reminding us all that we're not alone in our loss, and that can look different. Being able to navigate our way through can look different